AP Worlders. Today we are going to discuss imperialism. Imperialism occurs when a strong nation takes over a weaker nation or region and dominates its economic, political, and cultural life. Every case a nation must, in every case before a country can imperialize, they must industrialize first. Industrial countries imperialized for raw materials and markets to sell their manufactured goods. So there are four overall causes for imperialism. The first is the economic, and the economic was because of the Industrial Revolution. They needed the areas to get raw materials to make these manufactured goods, but then more importantly, they needed markets to sell these manufactured goods. So they would go to these places such as like India, get cotton from them, and then turn that cotton into textile, into cloth, and then sell it back to the people of India for a higher price. The second cause is nationalism. It was to demonstrate their power and prestige to the rest of the world. The third cause is the balance of power. The Europeans were forced to get new colonies to achieve this balance with their neighbors and their competitors. So if France got more land, Britain had to get more land, etc. And last is what is known as the white man's burden. And that was the idea that Europe was superior to all these other places, and they felt obligated to come help civilize these heathen savages. All right, here's some propaganda posters that you can see displaying the white man's burden. First, you have like a European having to carry a native. All right, or this advertisement here, the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Right, a soap ad. All right, and here's one more political cartoon showing the Europeans having to carry the natives of Asia and Africa, that they had to carry them. As you can see, this is Uncle Sam here because the United States, they also was involved in this imperialism. There were two types of colonies during imperialism. There were what were called tropical dependencies and settlement colonies. Settlement colonies are when Europeans made permanent homes and had full political control. Tropical dependencies is when there were a small number of Europeans that moved there and ruled large non-European populations. They would often keep the local leaders in control and rule the people through those local leaders, almost like puppet leaders. And to gain control, the Europeans often would exploit either long-standing ethnic and cultural divisions that already persisted there in that area. In the early colonies, the social systems were usually untouched. They didn't try to change things when they first started going to these places. The Europeans would adapt to the local living, such as their clothing, their food, their housing, especially in the weather. So like when they came to places down here, like Southeast Asia, right, they're used to wearing wool clothing because it's colder in Europe. They can't wear this wool clothing down here in Southeast Asia because it was, on the equator, real close to the equator, so it would be a lot warmer. The Europeans would also interact interracially, right? Interracial marriage and things like that was the norm. Later on, after more and more Europeans started to move there and settle, they attempted to change these colonies and make them more European. They would introduce European institutions, like government institutions, things like that. They would also increase the education, give them Western education, and as well as develop their Western technology, such as railroads, telegraphs, things like that. Since these colonies were so far away from their home country, their mother country in Europe, a lot of the local leaders who would come and settle these places would take advantage and do things on their own. Due to like how long it would take to get messages back and forth, they would start to make a lot of decisions on their own without contacting back the king. All right, the first area that we would like to look at is Africa, imperialism in Africa. Here's a look at Africa before heavy imperialism. All right, you can see that the Europeans were located here, and there's a little bit of French. Here, the Portuguese were in these East Coast trade cities. I remember from our last unit. All right, but it wasn't heavy European influence. Here's the Ottoman Empire here, and the names here, these are major indigenous African states before the Europeans would come. As you can see by these two maps, left and right, here is showing Africa after 1914, right? So you compare it to the previous map or even this map, see there was little European. On this map, you can see that the whole continent of Africa, besides for this spot and this spot here, were taken over by European countries. All right, so what started this mass imperialism in Africa? Belgium's actually going to begin it in 1880s, and this is going to be known as the Scramble for Africa. As you can see from this political cartoon, the European countries are all here trying to scramble for different parts of Africa. In Belgium, they're going to hold a conference. All right, it's going to be this Berlin conference, and they're going to meet. The Europeans are going to meet there to divide up Africa. They wanted to do it peacefully, try to avoid conflict there. The problem was they didn't account for the local African tribes or major states that we had seen in the map before this. And they're going to be forced to live together and work together, all right? Especially in the next unit, in the modern era, when they start to get their independence, right? These different groups that are now forced to live together, who had long history of, not being able to work together, is really going to cause a lot of the conflict that goes on in Africa in the 1900s and even today. All right, there's going to be two conflict areas, as you can see. This cartoon here shows one of those conflict areas, which is South Africa. It was conflict between the Dutch and the British. All right, the South African Dutch, they had long been established there, and they were called Boers or Afrikaners. And what happened was the British started to send people there. And then after they discovered diamonds and gold, war would begin, and the British would eventually win and take that land over. Those wars were known as the Boers Wars. The second conflict area is going to be here in Egypt. And that was once the Suez Canal came, that area also became important to the British. All right, so both Egypt and South Africa were important to the British because they wanted ways or places for their ships to stop on the way to the Pacific Ocean, especially India, which was their biggest money maker. All right, so at first they had to go down around here. They could stop in South Africa on their way to India. But then once the Suez Canal was created, it created this shortcut where you could go through here to get to India a lot faster. All right, and so the control of the Suez Canal was very important. France, they also wanted to get control of the Suez Canal, mainly just to stop the British from being able to get there to India as fast. And that's because of that long-standing rivalry that the French and the British had. Here's a good map that shows the British Empire in 1900. There was a saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire, meaning that they had land all across the globe, and that at some point the sun would be shining on the British Empire. All right, so here's the British, Europe, but then you can see they had Canada, in our hemisphere, but then in Africa, right, places throughout Egypt and South Africa, the ones we were just talking about, but also more land throughout there. India, which is going to be known as their jewel, right, their most important one. All right, and also this is when Australia is going to be not created, but when they're going to start to be populated by Europeans, and New Zealand, etc. All right, here's a good map. Show the Dutch, right, their land that they controlled. All right, they will lose this in the war. All right, but they also had a number of places out here in the Southeast Asia. All right, Java being one of their biggest. So imperialization in Asia and the Pacific is really going to begin with India when the British go there. And what happens is the British, they help local princes get power, and they keep those local princes as puppet leaders again. And there was no Indian united nationalism that was able to force the British out. They weren't united. And as I said before, India becomes the jewel of the British Empire. Some citizens of India are actually going to join the British Army in 1857 until what happens is known as the Sepoy Rebellion. After the British put down the Sepoy Rebellion of the British soldiers, that begins what is known as the British Raj, which is the British rule. And they're going to rule from 1858 all the way to 1947. All right, so they're going to formally take control after this rebellion. But there are going to be a lot of positives that's going to happen from the British coming to India. Positives such as Western education for many elites in India, social reforms, except for they didn't change the caste system, increase in the railroad and telegraph lines, as well as introducing India to the global market. But there are going to be a lot of negatives as well, such as a famine in India due to the emphasis of cash crops. And they're also going to drain India's resources and cause many people of India to be into poverty since they didn't own the means of production. Other places in Southeast Asia that we can see here, like Java, Burma, all right, those places are going to be a little bit more difficult to bring under European control than especially places in Africa because their governments were more stable. And they also had been already exposed to the Europeans. All right, remember the Europeans started to trade in this Indian Ocean trade during the last era, so they were already exposed to them. All right, so it was harder for the Europeans to bring them under control. But sometimes they would use force. All right, but often they would make treaties with these local leaders. And as the local leaders made more and more treaties, they would lose more and more land. But overall, in Africa, in Asia, Southeast Asia, Oceania, the reaction was either, well, in some areas it was violent, such as in warfare, such as like the Zulus in Africa. However, often it was reluctant acceptance. There was signed treaties and the ruling family would cooperate for money. And these elites would go to Europe to get education. The ironic point of this is that these elites that would get education, they would be the ones that would come back and lead these independence movements in the modern era. That's it for imperialism. See you guys in class.